Hello and welcome to Indus News Live with me, Osman Lone. We start with the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who's expressed concern over India's use of force to quell protests against the controversial citizenship law. Speaking to reporters in New York, UN spokesperson Stefan Jurec said the Secretary-General pressed India to respect freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Last week, the United Nations called India's new Citizenship Act fundamentally discriminatory. Meanwhile, mass protests continue across India against the controversial law. The government has banned public gatherings in northeast Delhi. The section is imposed after clashes between student protesters and police in the Indian capital's Salimpur area. 6 police have been killed in protests since last week, and thousands have been arrested by police. Well, in a related development, the Indian Supreme Court has issued a notice to the government seeking clarification over the controversial citizenship law. The court is hearing 60 petitions against the law filed by activist Harsh Manda, historian Irfan Habib and economist Prabhat Patanik and others. During a hearing, the court sent a notice to the central government asking it to publish the act for the public. The court adjourned the hearing till next week. In the pleas, the petitioners have argued that granting citizenship on religious basis goes against the grain of the Indian constitution. The petitioners asked the top court to declare the new law as unconstitutional. There have been widespread protests across the country since the new law came into effect. Meanwhile, Pakistan's minority Hindu community has rejected India's offer to grant them citizenship under a new law. New Delhi's controversial act offers citizenship to minorities from neighbouring countries. The Hindu Council said Pakistan's Hindu community unanimously rejects this bill, which is dividing India on communal lines. It said a true Hindu will never support this legislation. Pakistan's Sikh and Christian communities have also strongly rejected the bill, terming it against basic human rights. Indian-occupied Kashmir's economy has suffered loss of nearly $2.5 billion in 4 months of shutdown. Kashmir Chamber of Commerce and Industries has excess losses based on Valley's gross domestic product of the year. The body said studies had focused on 10 districts of the Valley, comprising 55% of total population. It said borrowers of financial institutions cannot fulfill their commitments, and a huge number of accounts will also go bankrupt. The KCCI said the present disruption and clampdown have resulted in loss of jobs for thousands of people. The New Delhi imposed curfew and communications blackout has entered its 136th day. US Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad has discussed the Afghan peace process with President Ashraf Ghani. Ghani's spokesperson Sadiq Siddiqui says Khalilzad briefed the president on the status of negotiations with the Taliban and the recent Islamabad meeting. He said Ghani expressed concern about continued violence by the Taliban. Siddiqui said the president told Khalilzad the Afghan people and the government want peace in the country. A spokesperson said both sides voiced hope that a ceasefire will soon take place in Afghanistan. The UN says an average of 9 children have been killed or maimed every day in Afghanistan in the year 2019. In a report, the global body said in 9 months, over 600 children were killed and over 1,800 injured. The report said data shows an 11% increase in the killings since last year. It said this situation is largely due to a surge in suicide bomb attacks and clashes between the Taliban and Afghan forces. The UN body said even by Afghanistan's grim standards, this year has been particularly deadly for children. Now, the Turkish Foreign Ministry warns Washington's move to lift a decades-old arms embargo on Cyprus will be a dangerous escalation. It says arms supply would hamper efforts towards a dispute settlement on the island. It added necessary measures will be taken against such initiatives. Cyprus has been divided since 1974, when Turkey invaded it in response to a coup engineered by the then military regime in Athens. In 1987, Washington then imposed the embargo to encourage a settlement between the Greek majority and Turkish minority. But yesterday, the US Senate voted to end the embargo on the island as part of a large defense spending bill. Well, the US Senate has approved a defense bill of $738 billion. The bill includes policy measures to sanction troops and others who committed war crimes in Syria. President Donald Trump has promised to immediately sign the Senate-approved bill into law. The bill creates a Space Force, the first new branch of the US military in over 60 years. The legislation claims for mandatory sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream gas pipelines between Russia and Europe. The bill also sanctions Turkey over its acquisition of a Russian defense system and prohibits the transfer of F-35 jets to Ankara. The bill defies any restrictions on the US president from waging war against Iran and the deployment of low-yield nuclear weapons. This is the most expensive set of military measures in the nation's history. Now, after years of delay, NATO will receive its second US-made Global Hawk drone tomorrow. The alliance aims to have the 5 unmanned aircraft in its $1.5 billion surveillance system operational in 2022. NATO says the drone system will be the world's most advanced. It will give NATO 24-hour near real-time surveillance of land and sea beyond its borders. An official says after Thursday's delivery of the second drone, 3 more will arrive before next summer. He said the alliance is attempting to create a small air force. US President Donald Trump has accused House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of declaring war on American democracy in a 6-page open letter. Trump faces an impeachment vote over allegations that he obstructed Congress and pressured Ukraine for personal political gain. Pelosi said she had not read the letter but found its essence to be sick. Only 2 former US presidents, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, have been formally impeached by Congress. Other than Trump, only Richard Nixon has faced a formal impeachment. Inquiry in the House of Representatives, no US president has ever been removed from office by this process. A simple majority in the House can impeach a president, followed by a trial in the Senate. Only a 2/3 Senate majority can remove a president of the United States from office. In Panama, 12 inmates have been killed and 13 others wounded in a gun battle inside a prison near the capital city. Police say the shootings occurred in a cell block of inmates from a single local gang. They said several guns were seized after the skirmish. President Laurentino Cortizo said the incident suggested jail guards helped smuggle in the weapons. In France, transport and public services remain disrupted as strikes against the government pension reforms entered their 14th day. Hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets in cities across the country. More in this report. From Eiffel Tower operators to doctors, the strikes have drawn French workers from all sectors of the economy. Protesters are demanding the government take back its pension reforms that ask them to retire later or face reduced payouts. But the government says it won't back down from its plan. Speaking in Parliament, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe said the reforms will be turned into a bill by January 2020.
We've clearly stated what our project is, and on this project, on the creation of a universal pension system, my determination, that of the government and that of the entire majority, is total. I am saying this clearly. Total.
Police fired tear gas to disperse the protesters in central Paris, but demonstrators are determined to continue the strike until their demands are met. Even pension chief Jean-Paul Delavoye's resignation could not calm their anger.
If we accept a Christmas break, then we're stopping the strike. If we don't strike, then Macron is passing his reform, since he said he's passing it in January. So, we have to stop him. We have to be logical. People didn't strike for about 15 days just to stop and say, no, let's go see Santa Claus.
French trade unions have called for a major push before the holidays, urging workers across all sectors to go on strike and join the countrywide protests. Now, it's been a year since the Sudanese started protesting for the removal of former dictator Omar al-Bashir. The ex-president was recently found guilty on corruption charges and sentenced to 2 years in detention. Sudan is now looking for a new start, but its economy is still in recession because of US sanctions. This report has more.
Sara Al-Fateh runs a cooking oil factory in Khartoum. She spends most of her day at a factory. and has a crew of dedicated workers. But she's struggling to keep the business running because she cannot order replacement parts for her machines. Al-Fateh blames American sanctions for the problem.
We can't make further investments on spare parts because we cannot open a bank account without a letter of credit because of the American sanctions.
Washington imposed a trade embargo on Sudan in 1997 over the state's alleged links to Al-Qaeda. The curbs affected Khartoum's access to international banking networks, as well as trade in technology and spare parts. The sanctions were eventually lifted in 2017, but the country is still on Washington's state sponsors of terrorism blacklist.
Absolutely no transfers are made from a bank inside Sudan to a country outside Sudan in a convertible currency, whether in dollars, sterling, euros, dirhams, or the Saudi riyal. Nothing. There is never any transfer done through the banking system.
In today's post-Bashir Sudan, inflation is hitting 60% and the country's foreign reserves are empty. The country's civilian-appointed Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok visited Washington, D.C. in December and asked for Sudan to be removed from the blacklist. But this won't happen until the U.S. is assured Bashir's regime is dismantled. As such, post-Bashir Sudan is off to a rough start.
In Malaysia, the Kuala Lumpur summit kicks off today and is being attended by leaders from Turkey, Iran and Qatar. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan arrived in Malaysia today to take part in the summit. Indonesia will be represented by Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi after Vice President Maruf Amin cancelled his scheduled visit. The summit aims to address issues of concern to Muslim countries. Japan is pressuring Russia to return 5 fishing vessels seized near the disputed islands north of Hokkaido. The Foreign Ministry says the crew did nothing wrong and should be quickly released on humanitarian grounds. It said the boats were seized by Russian border guards yesterday. The ministry said the crew members volunteered to show guards what they had on board. Russia asserts the boats were seized so they could be inspected. Meanwhile, Japanese Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi arrived in Moscow today ahead of a planned meeting with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. Well, we'll be back with more news from around the world right after this short break. Welcome back. Now Australia has recorded its hottest day as the national average temperature hit a record high of 40.9 degrees Celsius. The new record may not last long because forecasters are predicting a more intense heat wave later on in the week. The weather agency said the previous record of 40.3 degrees Celsius set in January 2013 fell on Tuesday. The reason for the scorching temperature is a positive Indian Ocean dipole, where the sea surface is warmer in the western half and cooler in the eastern ocean. The record comes as the nation battles a severe drought and bushfire crisis. Prime Minister Scott Morrison's government has been criticised for its response to the fires and its climate policies. Mexico City witnessed lots of funny business as clowns filled the streets with bursts of color and sound. The performers made their annual pilgrimage to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe. After dancing and singing through the streets, the clowns arrive at the iconic Mexican Basilica for Mass. Dressed in colorful costumes, professional praying sticks, and for all over Mexico, walk to the Basilica to end a Mass in the honor of the saint. The Virgin of Guadalupe is the patron saint of Mexico and revered by millions of Roman Catholics.
To give thanks for all the work, for all that has been achieved this year, and for another year to again visit her. It gives me joy and peace to walk this path.
Now in business news, car makers Fiat, Chrysler and Peugeot have agreed to a $50 billion merger deal. This will pave the way to create the world's 4th largest car manufacturer. A joint statement said the agreement provides for a merger on equal shares of their businesses. It said joining the French car maker PSA and American FCA aims to cut $4 billion of costs by combining technologies. The two mid-sized auto firms have not yet given their new company a name. Carlos Tavares will become the new chief of the merged business for an initial 5-year term. China's Dongfeng Motor will trim over 12% stake in the French carmaker by selling 31 million shares to PSA. Japan's exports have slipped for a 12th straight month in November, raising the risk of a fourth quarter contraction. The country's official data reveals exports fell about 8% year-on-year in November. Declining shipments to the US and China resulted in the longest period of falling exports since a 14th-month stretch to November 2016. Japan's trade balance posted a deficit of 82 billion yen, defying the gargantuan estimates forecasted by economists. Earlier this month, the country unveiled a $122 billion stimulus measure to help the economy. European stock markets are trading mixed following the UK Boris Johnson's Prime Minister block an extension of EU trade talks beyond 2020. Investors are monitoring the developments amid fears of a cliff-edge Brexit. Frankfurt's DAX is trading fractionally lower, London's FTSE 100 is trading marginally higher, and Pearson shares are over 3%. The CAC 40 in Paris is trading marginally lower, and Tokyo's Nikkei 225 closed over 0.5% lower, with auto shares declining. Well, it's 14 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's it. That's the news. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.